a group. This is the media environment that I grew up in. This is the media environment many of you grew up in. A handful of large organizations could send messages, identical copies of any one message, to disaggregated people at the edges of a network. This is how audiences were assembled. This is how it worked whether you owned a printing press or a broadcast tower. This is how it worked whether you were in the business of making books or music or movies. Right? The internet changes that. Right? The first obvious way it changed it is it makes those lines two-way. Right? Now people can talk back to the media outlets. But that's not where the freakouts are coming from. The freakouts are coming from here. The freakouts are coming from the fact that any two people connected to the network can now speak to one another directly, no professionals anywhere in sight, and they can do it in very large groups. Right? There are way more green lines than red lines. And that's not anything about technology, that's not anything about sociology, that's just math. That's just how networks work. What we're used to in the media environment is a world in which highly managed message senders then get to assemble these audiences. Right? That is, again, that's the media environment of the 20th century. What we've got now is this much looser, much frothier collection of any-to-any and many-to-many messages which can start from any place in the network and go to any place in the network. And the people here, right, are not operating in the traditional model of management. Right? In a managed media environment, the logic is filter then publish. Decide whether or not a message is worth the expense. Should we give the author an advance for this book? Should we greenlight this movie? Should we record this album? And then you publish it. Right? Out here, out in the network, the logic is publish then filter. Let anybody say anything and then sort the signal from the noise after the fact. It's that logic that the search engine business, among many others, is built on. And that change means that we don't just have a new way to reach the audience. It means that the idea of the audience as it was previously constituted is breaking down. We have to rethink everything that involves thinking about what the audience is and means and does. So here's a picture of the audience. This is a picture of people watching the Super Bowl. But it's a picture of people watching the Super Bowl from a sitcom. This is television's conception of what watching television is like. Right? Here's a picture of actual people watching the actual Super Bowl. Right? The difference, fairly plain. Right? It is no longer people just focused on the media. They are focused on the media and one another simultaneously in this big, sloppy mess. And figuring out the new kinds of communication strategies, but also the new sources of value in that kind of network is one of the big business challenges for grappling with social media. There are some good effects of this, and there are some bad effects of this. A few years ago, CVS, the drugstore chain, decided that they were going to get in the business of selling a disposable camera. It's $30 for the camera. You'd take it away, you'd record about an hour of video, you'd bring it back, they'd give you a DVD, and they'd take the camera back. Now, of course, the camera wasn't really a disposable $30 video camera. No one could make such a thing. It was a reusable video camera. And the idea was only CVS would be able to get your video off the camera and onto a DVD, so you'd always have to bring it back. They'd be able to wipe the drive and resell it. I'll ask you to join me in not being surprised that this happened instead. Hackers pried the back of it off. They said, hey, look at this, these pinouts over here with that orange ribbon. If you want to get the video off your camera, here's how you do it. Right? And thanks to the miracle of search, once that problem was solved once for anybody, it was solved for everybody, everywhere, all the time. So the upside for CVS is that these cameras started flying off the shelves. The downside was that very few of them flew back. And CVS said to themselves, we have a marketing and communications problem, right? The users don't understand how they're supposed to use these devices. So I know what let's do. Let's educate the users, right? And that's a really important phrase, educate the users. If you're in a meeting where that phrase is used, write down the time, because that marks the exact moment in the meeting when people ran out of ideas. And it turns out, in fact, that the users did not want to be educated to the idea that they bought something that they didn't own, that they could walk out of the store having paid their money for something they couldn't use the way they wanted. Right? And so the whole thing collapsed. CVS's experiment with the disposable video cameras simply failed. But that wasn't the end of the story, because there was one other company involved, and that was a company called Pure Digital. They were the ones that made the underlying hardware. And Pure Digital did not regard this as a Marcom failure. They regarded it as an R&D success. They said, what would happen if we treated the users as legitimate sources of information? What would we do? Maybe we'd sell them a one-button video camera. And thus was the flip camera born. Right? It was a response to the same information CVS got. What the Pure Digital people figured out was they were actually seeing unmet demand, not a Marcom failure. Right? And that is one of the big changes between the old audience-focused model of a public media network and a network with social media. In the 20th century, there were essentially two modes of communication between a company and the audience. If I'm a company and you're the customers, right, I can talk and you can shut up, and we call that advertising. Or you can talk and I can shut up, and we call that research. But there was no real model for, how about you talk and then I talk and we listen to each other? That idea of a conversational channel simply didn't happen. Right? And we can see from examples like this that in this environment, if you start to treat the users not just as people to be convinced to do things with advertising, but actually as people who have legitimate access to information that might affect the nature of your business, right? New kinds of things are possible besides regarding all of this as just a marketing and communications challenge. Right? So what does this mean for business strategy? One of the curious things about that world where people watching the Super Bowl are also talking to each other in all of these mediated ways at the same time is that the human element is reintroducing itself into the media environment, right? That in the 20th century, the model of media was we produce and you consume, right? It was essentially enforced by the underlying media we had. Now we've got a world where people can produce, consume, and share. We still like to consume, of course. People will always sit around and watch or listen to or read interesting things. But then we want to talk about it with people, and we want to share it, and we want to modify it, and we want to use the things we see, not just consume them. And so this idea of changing media strategy, of thinking about ways in which people can actively be engaged, not just as people who might buy things, eyeballs connected to wallets, but as people who might actually be engaged with the messages and with other people who are using, caring about the same products and services. So here is a famous e-commerce site selling a famous book. And what I want to call your attention to is not either the e-commerce site or the book, but the number of customer reviews. 6,021 customer reviews. Now you might think that some kind of consensus about Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone would have settled in after 2,000 or 3,000 reviews. But no, 6,021 customer reviews. And here is the 6,021st customer review. Full of creativity, you can read it very quickly, it's no surprise it's been a bestseller. This is the only review this person has ever done. Right? This is not a book review. Right? This is not someone saying, hey, there's this book, J.K. Rowling, you ought to check it out. Right? There's nothing like a traditional book review in this format. What this person is really doing is coming in and saying, Harry Potter, woohoo! Right? And Amazon is letting this happen. Right? Amazon is providing the platform, even though there's no way in which this is directly tied to any commercial advantage for them. A clue to why they're doing this is also on this page. I want to call your attention to the date. It was posted this morning. Another one may have been posted between the time I took this screenshot and now. This book was published last century, and somebody reviewed it this morning. Right? So what Amazon understands is that on top of any commercial, any transactional logic that can be bolted down to the idea of we have books and people buy them, there is this additional residue of people caring about books and wanting to say something about it in public. Right? And one strategy would be, well, you know, they've got email for that, they've got Twitter for that. They can say this stuff any place they like, right? But that's not Amazon's strategy. Amazon says if we give them a place to tell one another how much they love this book, it won't be good for business in any kind of directly transactional way. This person has already bought the book, and no one is going to buy the book based on the 6,021st recommendation. Oh, yeah, it was one of 6,020. It was really that last one that tipped it for me. It's not happening, right? But what is happening here is that there's a platform for human engagement that allows Amazon to have an audience that's more than just an aggregate of potential transactions.